The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello and welcome to this Gold Money Podcast with me, your host, Andy Duncan. Today I'm speaking to Dr. Guido Hülsmann, a professor of economics at the University of Angers in France and a senior fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. He's also the author of several excellent books, including The Ethics of Money Production and one of my favourite non-fiction books of recent times, Misess, The Last Knight of Liberalism. Guten Abend, Guido.
Good evening, Andy.
2012 marks a very special year for the Austrian school. It's the centennial of one of its most important books, A Theory of Money and Credit by Ludwig von Mises. This absolutely magnificent book was written when he was just 30 years old, published in 1912, and remains one of his four great magnum opus. To celebrate this anniversary event, a special Festschrift book is being produced, and Professor Hülsmann is writing the introduction. Guido, can you tell us why A Theory of Money and Credit is such an important book?
Mises is the first economist who has integrated the theory of money within the overall theory of subjective value that has been pioneered by Carl Menger in the 1870s. Before, during all of the 19th century, money somehow didn't fit very well into the framework, the analytical framework created by Adam Smith and his successors. And so the courses on money, if you wish, so the classes at the university on money were taught without much analytical interconnection between money banking, the theory of circulation on the one hand, and the theory of wealth creation on the other hand. So you had one course on real economics and the other class was on money banking finance. What Mises did was to integrate the theory of money within the overall edifice of the theory that explains how wealth is being created, which in itself had been improved by Carl Menger. So Carl Menger created a foundation for classical economics. Adam Smith had a very bad theory of value and a bad theory of prices, and as a consequence, he could not explain how savings were being invested by entrepreneurs and why. And Carl Menger provided the foundation to solve this problem or to answer such questions by coming up with a realistic theory of value and of prices. Now, what was missing once Menger had finished his job was to integrate money very well into that theory. Menger himself had not done this. He had left the theory of money prices a little bit in suspense. So Mises stepped in and he provided this missing link and therefore had the theory of money integrated in this general framework. On top of this, he did something else. He revised the entire literature on money and banking of the 19th century from the classic downward to the beginning of the 20th century. And in particular, he revised the great 19th century debate between the currency school and the banking school and came up with a new synthesis that was very strongly based on the work of the currency school, but also criticized the currency school and came up with a cleansed version of this. So he was not just some idiosyncratic theory of his own. He revised all these elements and integrated them within a systematic and non-contradictory whole. And of course, one of the best known elements today of Mises' own theory was his business cycle theory, which he developed in one of the last chapters of his book, in which he explains that artificial increases of the money supply are likely to entail intertemporal disequilibria, so that put the economy on an unsustainable path, right? Too many investments are made in the stages of production removed from consumption and cannot be ultimately be realized. So the economy is bound to crash at some point. So these are, of course, elements that it's this latter element that has been very much discussed in the past few years because it offers one way to explain the present difficulties that we confront on financial markets.
Because of a rotten historical twist of fate, this book was primarily reviewed back in 1912 in its original German by the up-and-coming Eminence Grise John Maynard Keynes. He found the book old-fashioned, and his unfortunate influential opinion killed the spread of the book in the English language. However, many years later, Keynes actually admitted he'd lacked enough German language skills to properly understand what he'd been reading. But he wrote the review anyway. Such was his kind of hubris. Now, Guido, if this book had been published, say, 50 years earlier and in English, how do you think the world might have been different today?
Let me first, since you mentioned it, quote Keynes. What Keynes actually, I will not quote the entire book review, but just maybe one of the opening sentences, okay, which gives you the gist. So he said that Mises' book was the work Now that's Keynes, right? Quote, "The work of an acute and cultivated mind, but it is critical rather than constructive, dialectical, and not original. The author avoids all the usual pitfalls, but he avoids them by pointing them out and turning back rather than by surmounting them." Now, this sounds, so this unquote, right? So this was the quote. This sounds kind of generous, right? This is a generous assessment of a thoroughly boring, unoriginal author. But I mean, it gives you really, as you say, right? It kills the book because it gives you it insinuates there's really not much that you can find there except some, boring summary of what everybody else was supposed to know in the first place. Now, this is definitely not what Mises' book is about. That Mises delivers, in particular, scathing critique of the banking school theory, which by the late 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, had become dominant, not only in the German-speaking world, in Austria and Germany and Switzerland, but also in particular in Great Britain. And from there, it was spreading to the United States. It had the endorsement, most notably, of John Stuart Mill. The basic point of this theory was that it was suitable to have a money supply that was being flexible, right? So you needed to have an elastic money supply, and that was best provided by fractional reserve banking, and if necessary, it could and should be provided by central banking and also by the creation of fiat money.
And then we have the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, 1 year after this, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, and this creation was justified with banking school argument, right? So the entire case for central banking as we know it today rests on banking school foundation. And Mises shows in his book that all the essential postulates of the theory are wrong, right? So it's not necessary to have an elastic money supply. It's not the case that fractional reserve banks provide some helpful service to equilibrate the demand for and supply of money and so on, right? All of this is shown to be wrong in Mises' book with arguments that have never been refuted until the present day.
So there's no ideal amount of money, that you don't have to keep manipulating the money supply.
Exactly, right? So but this is of course a point that was not made by Mises himself. He emphasized this point, but he never said that he himself was the originator of this idea. This is the central idea of classical economics, in particular of Ricardo's theory of money. Ultimately, the money supply doesn't matter. Of course, you need money as a medium of exchange, because otherwise you do not get an extended division of labor, you don't get capital accumulation, and so on. But the absolute level of the money supply is irrelevant. Whether you operate with a high money supply, with a big money supply, or a small one, ultimately is irrelevant for the economy as a whole. If you change the money supply, there are advantages for individual households, individual firms, but not for the economy as a whole. Right? So that's the central point that he took over from Ricardo, and that is the central point on which he distinguishes himself from all of his contemporaries who had given up on this idea, and therefore there is today still this big difference between Austrian monetary theory as springing from Mises, developing from Mises, most notably in the work of George Hülsmann and Murray Rothbard, Pascal Sanlin, Walter de Soto, and others, on the one hand, and all the rest of mainstream monetary theory on the other hand, which is thoroughly grounded on the ideas of the banking school. But we can raise the question, would the world have been different if Mises had been published 50 years before? Maybe yes. Maybe yes, might have contained the influence of the banking school. It might have contained the influence of Keynesianism, because Mises was clearly, this is another thing that I didn't mention before, he was the pioneer of what we call today monetary macroeconomics. It was not Keynes, right? So Mises was the first one to provide an analysis of the working of the economy as a whole based on monetary exchange. It was not Keynes. Keynes came some 20 years later. But still, right, I mean, maybe it would not have been sufficient. Ultimately, there's one powerful force that has always been slowing down the influence of Mises' ideas, which was the self-interest of government and of public or state institutions, such as central banks in particular. Right? So they would have tried to promote their ideas on the self-perceived importance of their own work, and they could have done this in particular through the takeover of higher education, which started, so the government takeover of higher education started approximately in the 1870s, 1880s. before there were very few professorships in political economy or economics, as it was later called. And then government started to hire substantial numbers of people, and they did this exponentially after World War II. And of course, you can imagine the kind of people that government hiring committees would prefer, namely those that were by and large convinced that the case for monetary interventionism through central banks and other techniques was watertight and needed to be translated into practice. I'm somewhat skeptical, even if Mises had been published before, might still be due to these mechanisms of ensuring that the right opinions are being conveyed to the rising generations and so on, that his ideas would have spread sufficiently to prevent the rise of central banking, to prevent the rise of fiat money, and with it the promotion of fractional reserve banking, etc. Today things are a little bit different thanks to the internet, but we will see how far this will go.
I often wonder, actually, what would have happened if Keynes had been taught better German when he was a younger man, and if he'd understood the book, and then he might have changed around. But maybe, according to your thinking, it wouldn't have made any difference because the banking school would have just discarded Keynes and somebody else would have arisen.
Keynes is a very complex character, right? So I'm also wondering how much did he cherish things like truth, and how much did he believe that there was such a thing as truth in the first place, and how much didn't he have a certain political agenda for which he was trying to coin arguments. But I'm not enough of a Keynes scholar to be able to answer those questions.
I think we could spend 4 hours on that, and I don't think the listeners of this podcast would appreciate that. Now, I'm unfortunately English, and what that means is I still think fog in the channel means the continent is cut off. So could you tell us what a Festschrift is?
A Festschrift is a book dedicated to the celebration of a person or of an event. Typically, it's celebration of whatever, the 60th birthday or the 70th birthday, and always a round birthday of a scholar that has marked all the people who write chapters for that book. In our case, it is a Festschrift in celebration of an event, so the centennial of the first publication of Mises' monetary treatise. So
who, apart from you then, is contributing to the book?
Well, we have a total of 13 chapters. I'm the author of one of them. There are next to me a couple of other senior scholars. So there's, for example, Joe Salerno, who is very well known for his work on Austrian monetary theory. Gary North, who is very well known both on the academic side and in the investment world. And we have also Renaud Filleul, who is a colleague of mine in France. He's a professor of sociology, but with very strong interest in Austrian economics and Austrian macroeconomics in particular. And then the other authors are either young and upcoming assistant professors or even very talented, exceptional graduate students. So we have two of my doctoral students, authors. One is Amadeus Gabriel, who is fellow from Austria. So he's a native Austrian, and he has written a passionate chapter on the German language predecessors of Mises' book. And another one is Matt McCaffrey, who is American and has written comparison between Mises' theory of money and two other now famous monetary books written by young Austrian authors at the time. Now, not of the Austrian school, but Austrian natives, namely Josef Schumpeter, who is well known, and Hilferding, who is an Austro-Marxist and wrote a book on finance capital.
Whoa, Austro-Marxist, that scares me.
Yeah. No, actually, it is a very interesting book. If you are ever at leisure, I do recommend that you read it. In particular, the last part, right? The third part of the book is really passionating because he is very strong in highlighting the socio-political implications of fractional reserve banking. He sees very well through the logic of a fractional reserve banking system. The problem is only that he makes the wrong inferences from it. Right? He says, well, Meinert, what he says is, look, this is where capitalism gets us. And here it gets wrong, right? Because fractional reserve banking, especially if promoted through central banks and other forms of government interventionism, is of course not a form of capitalism, right? The free market economy based on the sanctity of private property rights, but is a very strongly interventionist system and therefore entails the typical consequences of interventionism, namely cronyism, disequilibria, crises, etc., etc.
I also think it's strange how socialists do seem to get it half right all the time, but their solution to government is to have more government.
Yes, absolutely.
When's the Festschrift going to be published?
It will be at the end of this year. So we're still trying to get it out in the Advent season, so to benefit from the Christmas business. but in the worst of all cases, it will be released right after Christmas. So we will have a publication in 2012. We will have the true centennial publication.
I believe Thorsten Polleit is writing a section. Can you tell us what he's writing about?
Thorsten Polleit is writing a Misesian critique of central banking. So he has created a synthesis of the main arguments, so conveying the spirit of Misesian arguments against central banking, right? And shows that they are still relevant today, and compares them with typical arguments in favor of central banking.
Who's actually publishing the book?
It will be the Ludwig von Mises Institute.
Getting back to more modern times, we've seen the rise of QE to infinity, with major central banks buying up all sorts of junk bonds and mortgage-backed securities on a basically perpetual basis, trying to prop economies up with what they call stimulus and 0% interest rates. Now, I know that you Austrian economists dislike being tied to time frames, and we never know which way people like Ben Bernanke or Mario Draghi are going to go whenever they cause problems. But how do you see the current global financial situation evolving based on Austrian school theory?
Well, I think the crucial is always, ultimately, it always revolves around interest rates, right? If you ask how long are governments able to pursue this course of action that has been espoused now for a few years, how long will they be able to do this? Well, as long as the budget stands, right? As long as even though they have to get into more debt, as long as they can finance these additional debts and so on. And right now they can finance these additional debts, especially the US government and the German government, and to some extent also the French and the British governments. They can still do this because interest rates are extremely low. We are at an all-time low. Right? So we have actually the funny thing was, for example, in the case of German debt, that the total payments, so the total part of the budget of the German government's budget shrank from 2008 through 2010, because even though they got into more debt, they had to pay lower interest rates. Right? So therefore, the total amount that had to be used for the debt service diminished. But of course, these happy times will not hold on indefinitely, right? Sooner or later, interest rates will rise, and they will rise with a bang. Of course, here I cannot tell you exactly when it will be, but just to give you one idea, I think for the interest rate, one crucial determining factor is the inflation rate, or price inflation rate more precisely. So if you have significant consumer price rises, then ultimately this gets translated into the interest rate. We are already now at a point where the real return on investments, capital investments, especially financial investments, has been negative for the past few years. Not very strongly negative, but slightly negative for most types of investments, in particular if you held your money in forms of an insurance or some pension fund and so on. Usually that was negative. Now, investors, savers, are willing to tolerate this for a while, but not indefinitely. And right now, again, so the figures are somewhat moderately negative and so on. And still there are doubts because we do not fully trust the way the inflation rate is being calculated. People feel that the inflation rate is higher than the one that is officially communicated. So to make a long story short, that as soon as savers and investors get the impression, well, we actually lose money massively, well, then they will move out those assets that make them lose money. And as a consequence, the prices of those assets will shrink and the implied return will increase. And that will hold true for U.S. government bonds and for German bonds, for British bonds, for French bonds, etc. And then the party really gets going. Then, of course, we get even stronger disequilibria in the public budget, and the process then will start to accelerate. And from that point on, it will not last indefinitely. We will either get to a crisis situation very, very soon, that is within 2 or 3 years, or we will get to a hyperinflationary scenario. And then ultimately, I mean, you can run the whole scenario through. Hyperinflation can then, I mean, once it gets into the exponential phase, it goes very fast. It's a year or two. And then you have the choice either of ruining the entire monetary system, have a collapse, or revert to some form of currency reform. And I expect the latter to happen. So how far are we away from this situation? Difficult to say. Again, right, the crucial question is how quickly will prices rise and how strongly. So here I've misguessed already last year. So last year I made a guess, well, that we might get in the higher one-digit inflation rates or lower two-digit inflation rates by this time of the year. It has not happened, right? Again, according to official data, it has not happened. So you see, you shouldn't ask me, right? I'm a bad guesser. But if we get to this point, within, right, again, the next year or the next 2 years or something like this, as from this point, we get the kind of trouble that I mentioned before, right? We unhinge public finance, and from then on, the dynamics will go much faster than they have gone so far.
Now, I know we, the Austrians, are a small school, even though we're completely right about everything. But once we enter this sort of Detlef-Schlichter paper money collapse, and we go into this Keynesian abyss, do you think we can come in and save the day, or will we still be ignored?
No, we will not be able to save the day because too few people know something about Austrian economics, and in particular in Europe, and in particular among people who are not part of either academia or financial market analysts. I mean, among financial market analysts, the Austrians are pretty well known, or have become pretty well known in the past 5 years. I don't think it's always a very in-depth knowledge. In most cases, it's actually very superficial. But at least, right, Austrian economics has become a household word. These people also know what kind of policy recommendations the Austrians have in store for them. I myself have also given in the past few years regularly seminars for higher administration within the European Union. So some of those people are interested in the whole subject and very well informed about the subject as well. But if we look at the political class, there's virtually no knowledge of these things at all. I mean, you can count the people who know something about Austrian economics among policymakers in Europe. You can count them probably on one or two hands. And that is not sufficient. And in the larger public, it's the picture is similarly dark. So we have a long way to go to make it into public consciousness. What I expect if we move into the abyss, and the abyss, we will move into it in one way or another, is that Austrians' ideas are likely to become even better known, right? So it will not help us for this time. I don't think that there's no chance that this would happen. It will not help us for this time, but Austrian ideas are spreading by leaps and bounds, right? So this is the good thing. But it will not be enough to get us out of the abyss this time. And let's say even if, right, they were sufficiently well known, this of course does not mean that applying the Austrian ideas will get us out of trouble, right? It's quite to the contrary. What the Austrians typically recommend is to solve the present disequilibria, imbalances, by drastic adjustment measures. That is, by massive defaults, massive bankruptcies, and so on, accepting skyrocketing unemployment, etc., etc. Right? So it will be actually even more painful if you apply Austrian ideas than if you continue trying to apply Keynesian ideas. At least in the short run, it's more painful.
So we'll take a lot of heroin addicts addicted to cheap money and we'll give them cold turkey.
Yeah, that's how it looks like, yeah.
Moving slightly adrift from this and getting onto the euro again, there have been some rumours going around recently that the German government's overseas gold savings have been leased out into the marketplace, never to return to Germany. I know you're currently in France, but are the German people aware of these rumours? And if so, how are they responding to them, especially as they're also being asked to bail out Southern Europe to help keep the euro project alive?
I've been interested in the question for quite a few years. And 2 years back, I finally got to talk to one former president of the Bundesbank. And I asked him, so where do you guys keep your gold? I mean, they have the second biggest gold owners, according to official statistics, right, by the World Gold Council and so on. So they publish always the statistics of who are the biggest gold owners. And first is the United States, Treasury, second is the German Bundesbank, third is the IMF, and so on, right? Fourth is I think Italy, and fifth is France, and so on and so on. Right, so the Germans supposed to hold around 4,000 tons of gold. So where are they? Right? And so he replied, well, I mean, all this gold, that doesn't matter. I mean, we don't really care about this gold, and we never cared about this. Most of this is kept outside. So he told me, well, he thinks it was something like 5% that is being kept in Germany, and the rest outside. Essentially, with the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of France. Now, that was in 2005, okay? And it corresponded by and large to what later on, last year and at the beginning of this year, had been communicated to the press. Now, thanks to Ron Paul's initiative in the United States to audit gold holdings of the Fed, a similar initiative was made by two German members of parliament who belong both, I believe, to the CDU, which is the ruling party. But so there was somewhat rebellious backbenchers. And they said, well, I mean, how do we know that all our gold is still there? So they went, I think, in February to New York and were actually received by representatives of the Federal Reserve and led to the gold storage facilities in New York City. And so they were shown gold bars. Of course, they didn't test them and so on, right, to make sure that it's not tungsten. But apparently, so the gold was there, fine. So they returned to Germany, and the whole thing then was, and they said, well, we should also audit all of this stuff, and we should also audit our holdings with the Bank of England and the Bank of France. This went through the press, Andy. Right? So it was actually the number one tabloid in Germany. Bild had a couple of cover stories already on the whole thing. Especially in the past few weeks, there had been several front-page reports on the procedure of this, especially since the Bank of France and the Bank of England refused to have these two MPs visit the vaults and have a look at the German gold, right? Okay, so this was very funny, very intriguing. So it showed there was mounting political pressure to somehow audit the gold and verify, well, it exists, it's still there, it is actually gold, it's not something else, and so on. And now the last thing that I just noticed was 1 or 2 weeks ago was that the German Bundesbank publishes information about the whereabouts of its gold holding. And lo and behold, they say that more than 1,000 tons out of the, 3,700 or 4,000 that they own, more than 1,000, so almost a third or so, are actually in Germany. Now, that is very intriguing because, I mean, right, you understand my surprise because the last information I have it was 5%. So it's just a very small amount, and now suddenly we're up to 33%. So what does this mean? I mean, if this is true, okay, I have no way of verifying this, but why should they lie so blatantly? Because now they risk being audited by German MPs and other people. What this implies is that they must have recovered a large chunk of their gold, maybe just in the past 2 years, from its partners overseas and in Europe and in Britain. And this is interesting both on economic grounds and also on political grounds.
Speaking of the Deutsches Bundesbank and the ECB, one of the funniest things I've ever seen is the giant euro statue in the centre of Frankfurt. Do you think that statue is going to be pulled down in Germany in the next few years, or do you think the Germans will keep the euro? Yeah,
I think the Germans will keep the euro. I mean, the prestige of the desirability of European integration and paying even a very high price to preserve the political integration of Europe is very strong in Germany. I mean, I've said this for years and I've always been proven. So this was one of the forecasts, Andy, where I've always been right, right? Here I've always been right. And I always said the Germans will pay, okay? And they have paid, and they keep on paying now, and they will also pay in the future, and still you get a revolution in Germany. But so far there's no revolution in sight because there's no political force in Germany that could somehow bundle this resistance. Right? The basic problem that you have in Germany is that the entire political establishment, whatever party you look at, they are all thoroughly pro-German, and they give a damn for the majority opinion among Germans. So if you had a public referendum today, next week, in a month, even next year, about the euro and possibly also about European integration, you would get a majority against. But there's no political force in Germany that bundles this majority. So
do you think they're going to go down then with Greece and Spain and everywhere else?
Yeah, a little later, right? A little later. But yeah. I mean, by and large, that is happening.
Now, I could talk to you for hours about these things, but I think we better wrap up now. Before we go, for those who want to get hold of your own superb books, Guido, on Mises and on money, where's the best place to get hold of them?
Well, for you, people in Europe, it would probably be Amazon.com, because they have very low shipping costs. For all people in the United States, the Misess Institute, right? This is by far the best place, the cheapest place to get books from and on Mises.
And are you writing anything else except the Festschrift at the moment?
I'm working on a German language book dealing with the culture of inflation and the crisis of this inflation culture, which I will explain a little bit on Austrian capital theory and apply Austrian theory to financial markets and so on. So this will probably be published next year. And I'm also working on a book on the evolution of Mises monetary thought.
That first book sounds fascinating. Are you going to get someone to translate it for you, or are you going to translate it yourself?
Well, if you have a talented translator at hand, well, please let me know. I'm interested. But first, I need to write this to finish the whole project. I hope I will be done within the next 2 or 3 months. And then we'll look at the rest.
Okay, I shall contact Robert Grötzinger and get him to do it for you.
Yes, yeah, he has been my translator in the past. Yeah, would be wonderful. But then, of course, yeah, I need a sponsor. So if Gold Money is interested, I'm interested as well.
Superb. Anyway, thank you. Herzlichen Dank, Herr Professor Guido Hülsmann, and thank you for your time tonight.
Herzlichen Dank auch an Sie. Guten Abend.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.
Likely to entail intertemporal disequilibria, so that put the economy on an unsustainable path, right? Too many investments are made in the stages of production, removed from consumption, and cannot be ultimately be realized. So the economy is bound to crash at some point. So these are, of course, elements that, it's this latter element that has been very much discussed in the past few years, because it offers one way to explain the present difficulties that we confront on financial markets.
Because of a rotten historical twist of fate, this book was primarily reviewed back in 1912 in its original German by the up-and-coming eminence grise John Maynard Keynes. He found the book old-fashioned, and his unfortunate influential opinion killed the spread of the book in the English language. However, many years later, Keynes actually admitted he'd lacked enough German language skills to properly understand what he'd been reading. But he wrote the review anyway. Such was his kind of hubris. Now, Guido, if this book had been published, say, centennial of one of its most important books, A Theory of Money and Credit by Ludwig von Mises. This absolutely magnificent book was written when he was just 30 years old, published in 1912, and remains one of his four great magnum opus. To celebrate this anniversary event, a special Festschrift book is being produced, and Professor Hülsmann is writing the introduction. Guido, can you tell us why A Theory of Money and Credit is such an important book?
Mises is the first economist who has integrated the theory of money within the overall theory of subjective value that has been pioneered by Karl Menger in the 1870s. Before, during all of the 19th century, money somehow didn't fit very well into the framework, the analytical framework created by Adam Smith and his successors. And so the courses on money, if you wish, so the classes at the university on money were taught without much analytical interconnection between money, banking.
The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello and welcome to this Gold Money Podcast with me, your host, Andy Duncan. Today I'm speaking to Dr. Guido Hülsmann, a professor of economics at the University of Angers in France and a senior fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. He's also the author of several excellent books, including The Ethics of Money Production and one of my favourite non-fiction books of recent times, Misess, The Last Knight of Liberalism. Guten Abend, Guido.
Good evening, Andy.
2012 marks a very special year for the Austrian school. It's the
theory of circulation on the one hand and the theory of wealth creation on the other hand. So you had one course on real economics and the other class was on money, banking, finance. What Mises did was to integrate the theory of money within the overall edifice of the theory that explains how wealth is being created, which in itself had been improved by Karl Menger. So Karl Menger created a foundation for classical economics. Adam Smith had a very bad theory of value and a bad theory of prices, and as a consequence, he could not explain how savings were being invested by entrepreneurs and why. And Karl Menger provided the foundation to solve this problem or to answer such questions by coming up with a realistic theory of value and of prices. Now, what was missing once Menger had finished his job was to integrate money very well into that theory. Menger himself had not done this. He had left the theory of money prices a little bit in suspense. So Mises stepped in and he provided this missing link and therefore had the theory of money integrated in this general framework. On top of this, he did something else. He revised the entire literature on money and banking of the 19th century from the classic downward to the beginning of the 20th century. And in particular, he revised the great 19th century debate between the currency school and the banking school and came up with a new synthesis that was very strongly based on the work of the currency school, but also criticized the currency school and came up with a cleansed version of this. So he was not just some idiosyncratic theory of his own. He revised all these elements and integrated them within a systematic and non-contradictory whole. And of course, one of the best known elements today of Mises' own theory was this business cycle theory, which he developed in one of the last chapters of his book, in which he explains that artificial increases of the money supply are